Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get podcasts. And thank you for supporting long-form conversation on Patreon. I love having these discussions. And, there's only so much that TV can do. There's only so much that radio can do. Podcasts are an awesome medium. And thanks to supporters like you, we can have long-form discussions. So go to patreon.com/Matt Lewis and help us do what we do. All right. I'm excited about today's guest. It's James Lindsay. You've probably heard of him. He's the founder of Discourses. He's a math PhD, and he is the co-author of the book Cynical Theories: How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity. James Lindsay, welcome to the news.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Great talking with you. I think most people probably first heard about you when you were involved in this hoax, where you put together these papers about I forget what it exactly. It was like a Grievance Study papers, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And you ended up winning some, I guess, awards for things that were like completely concocted. In one case, I think you took an essay from Mein Kampf, and
that's right. Yeah.
That was really an amazing stunt. Talk for those who don't know or who don't know enough. Talk about that.
Yeah. So that is. I mean, I like to joke that I'm probably most well known for my writing about dog sex, and that turns out to be the case because one of these papers, in fact, it's the one that did win an award for excellence in feminist geography scholarship, was about observing dog sex and deriving conclusions about human rape culture from allegedly watching dogs hump each other at the dog park, and then the way people reacted to their dogs humping each other at the dog park. And so we wrote this absolutely absurd paper about that, and that was accepted. And like I said, it was given recognition, special recognition as exemplary scholarship in the field. It concluded that if we were to start training men the way that we train dogs, then maybe we could get rid of rape culture. Shock collars, leashes. No, really.
This has been thought of, I'm sure.
And so another one of our papers, as you noted, we took a chapter out of Hitler's Mein Kampf and rewrote it as intersectional feminism, as it's called, in terms of solidarity. We titled it Our Struggle is My Struggle. And obviously Mein Kampf is my struggle in German. And so, we slid this one in to we actually sent it first to a feminist theory journal, and they didn't accept it, but they were pretty complimentary of it and gave us some suggestions. So we revised it and sent it to a feminist social work journal, which accepted it, which to our great surprise. We really didn't think that one had much of a chance. So we ended up actually writing 20 papers like that. That's kind of the two that are most famous out of the 20. And 7 of them were actually accepted before the Wall Street Journal caught on and made it go public, at which point the 7 that were still under consideration, just kind of died. And we don't know what would have happened with those. So yeah,
it's like Borat. Once people are onto Borat, you can't keep it going as easily.
Yeah, I mean, if a guy, with a big thing of weird black hair and a mustache and a single piece man bikini neon yellow shows up at your door, not to fall for that. So anyway, yeah, we were trying actually to do a couple of things. We were trying to show that what passes as scholarship in those disciplines is some cause for alarm. And we were also trying to show that we were competent enough to speak about that scholarship and prove it by getting papers published that we were intentionally bending the rules, and said we weren't even trying to be serious, and still could get papers published because we were informed enough about the relevant scholarship. And that scholarship is what we then did Cynical Theories about.
How did you? So I'm very curious of your background. I mentioned you're a math PhD, but obviously you had a passion to expose the bullshit, which I think you very clearly did. Obviously, you had a lot of fluency with. I mean, there is a way the shibboleths and the vernacular and sort of just. I mean, okay, if you're plagiarizing Hitler, in that case, it's sort of a copy and paste. But you know, in some of these cases, you had to like use the verbiage that people involved in critical race theory and whatever, how many wave feminism, whatever, that they would use. How did you? How did you get here? What's the backstory on how you find yourself involved in this project?
Well, I'll tell you, but real quick, you said plagiarizing Hitler reminds me of a funny kind of like aside with this whole thing. So one of my colleagues works in a university, Peter Bogosian, that did this with us. And so Peter got brought up on a number of charges by his university for his involvement in this project. And one of the charges that they brought against him was plagiarizing Hitler. And so he pled guilty to that. And then once he pled guilty to plagiarizing Hitler, they dropped the charge, which I think is really funny. But that's not
That
how
should
I
be
got
the.
into
He
it.
should write a book called "Plagiarizing Hitler" because that's a
That's
great
actually pretty
title.
funny. I'm going to suggest that to him. That's a really good
He
idea.
should do it. I think that's a bestseller.
So anyway, how I got into this was the best way possible. I grew up watching Seinfeld, and it's, I guess, sort of relevant because it's that sort of style of humor, just these sort of certain types of absurd things. But in one of my favorite old episodes of Seinfeld, Jerry's ranting about Kramer, and he's talking about how nothing in Kramer's life makes sense. And then he says that Kramer tends to fall ass backwards into money as to one of the things. And that's what happened. It's not money, but I fell ass backwards into this whole project. I left the university in 2010 after I finished my PhD that had nothing to do with anything interesting, except if you think my family is interesting. It was a family based decision, not a academic or political or anything like that decision. And so I got academically bored. I started kind of getting interested in studying, philosophy and psychology and these other fields that I could read and just kind of learn on my own. And I started getting involved in these kind of online discussion things and eventually on Twitter. And one thing led to another. And the next thing you know, I'm involved in this new atheism movement, which, having been a non-believing person living in the Southeast, growing up in the 80s and 90s, the first question you literally get asked after what your name is what church do you go to? So all of a sudden, I had a lot of kind of stuff to get out. So I got involved in this new atheism movement where I felt like I could finally speak up about this stuff for the first time. And the new atheism movement was getting attacked. It actually, a lot of people don't realize, but all the stuff that's playing out now in society and all the stuff that was famously playing out in the universities in 2015 and 16, that all happened in the atheism movement way before, way earlier. And you could even say that the Me Too movement hit the new atheism thing in 2011. It just didn't have that name. The exact same thing happened. People in prominent positions got accused of sexual misfeasance. The definition of sexual impropriety became very expansive. Lots of accusations that were of questionable credibility got mixed in with accusations that were of very high credibility, that were very concerning, and the whole dynamic played out within that kind of like closeted environment in 2011 going into 12, and it ultimately ended up breaking the movement. But this ended up bringing all of this kind of discussion at that time, mostly of sexism in a systemic sense, into focus for people that were involved in it. And Peter and later Helen Pluckrose and I got interested enough to actually decide to look at the source, to start looking at the academic literature that these people were kind of pointing to. And Peter and I decided at just one of those fateful days where we were having a conversation. It wasn't over drinks or anything, but we were laughing like it was. And we just decided for a variety of reasons that maybe we should attempt an academic hoax on gender studies. And then it kind of just fell into place from there. I thought it was a fun idea. I wasn't drowning in anything else to do. And so we wrote one pretty quickly and just started screwing around with it. one thing led to another, and then the next thing you know, we were writing a project, a formalized project with a plan with 20 of them and the whole thing. So it fell ass backwards into it.
Wow. So it sounds like you started off just being mischievous, having fun, and then at some point you're like, "Wow, this could actually be a hoax that makes a point that actually changes things."
I mean, that's more or less right. And like I said, I started off kind of saying that Seinfeld's very much my style of humor, kind of like a mini Children of the 90s. But that kind of general, that branch of mischief has always sort of been my style. When we were growing up, my brother, my friends and I, my brother, we all kind of like teased each other and harassed each other very much in that kind of, I don't know, fake news sort of style. What can you get somebody to believe? I have a friend named John who you can never quite tell to this day. He's almost 40, and he's still, to this day, you can't ever quite tell if he's telling you a true story or a tall tale about his life. And it's always kind of been the style of humor that we grew up pulling on each other. It's like,
Well, I mean, and Seinfeld obviously had that. You had the Kramer being coerced into wearing the AIDS ribbon, or he refuses to wear the AIDS ribbon
that's right.
at a marathon or something, at a race. You've got the soup Nazi, and then Larry David, of course, has continued with that sort of comedy, which used to be liberal. I mean, I'm a conservative, so we used to consider that like liberal Hollywood, but now all of these things have gone full circle, and now it's sort of considered, by some people would be considered, almost conservative, because it's actually promoting what we used to call liberal liberal values of like tolerance and sort of the right to be wrong and free speech and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it's funny how that sort of switched a little bit. Where I think it's even a little bit. The left has become, and I hate to be so broad as to say the left, but what we normally are referring to as the left has become generally quite intolerant. I even remember it long before this woke thing broke out. I remember talking to a friend of mine who's a Republican, and I was very much a Democrat, or Democrat leaning at the time. I've always technically been independent, but I was definitely Democrat leaning. And I was talking to him and I said, I don't think you actually agree with any of the Republican platform. He was like, no, I actually went through. I went through it and went through both the Democratic and Republican platform and just put check marks by how many of the points I agree with. And I agree with like 24% of the Republican platform, and I agree with like 87% of the Democratic platform. And I was like, then why are you so proudly Republican, and your conservative memes and everything else all the time? And he said, well, because they treat people like crap, and I don't want to become one of those people. And I remember that article around the same time. There was an article that came out that was talking about how something had gone wrong on the left half of America, because it's like you can't go to a barbecue without somebody telling you you're eating the wrong kind of hot dog, or that you shouldn't eat hot dogs at all. It was definitely about hamburgers and hot dogs. And I
Some
thought,
people Well, some people trace this. Some people trace this to Twitter. Some people trace it to, I don't know. I forget what it was. I guess it was when Twitter hit college universities in like 2012. I'm trying to remember, but like, do you have a sense for when we went from being liberal to being left to being intolerant, and when that transformation happened?
it's hard to pin it down at the level of culture, and to say what caused it, but certainly social media played some significant role. I think that these kind of scolding, almost nun-like leftists have been with it. I mean, they've been with us for a long time. The whole radical feminism thing, anti-pornography, the sex negative radical feminists in the 80s were extremely scolding, kind of very nun-like characters, as a matter of fact. And in many cases, definitely not the kind of Camille Paglia as a counterpoint style feminist. And so you had this sort of like scolding thing, and then scolding for some reason worked. And maybe social media had a lot to do with it taking off. We definitely recognized it was somewhere between 2009 and, I don't know, maybe 12, 13 is when it started to really become like, oh, getting bitched out by your friends for having the wrong choices if you are friends with people on the left is just what's going to happen. Like, you eat the wrong food, you drove the wrong car, everything's a crisis. I can't believe you're like that. And I mean, I do think that there was a lot to the Facebook and Twitter. More Facebook was the experience I was having at the time going public. Whereas at first it was just college campuses. In fact, it was probably just created so Zuckerberg could check out chicks at Harvard.
Literally, if you've seen The Social Network, that is the the genesis of.
Oh man, I was on Facebook really early on. I mean, preposterously early on. When I was in grad school, I joined it in like 2003 or 4. I mean, really early. And at the time, I remember it was like I could go look up my students or whatever, and it's like there's all of their pictures of them partying. It's like, here's my dorm room number, here's my phone number. Like, all of it was just there. And what a horror show, and what a terrible idea. And so there was something though about it going public, because I remember that's when I realized I was so, I was smug about it. I was so proud of myself. I was vindicated. In college, I was in a philosophy class, and one of our classroom discussions was about superpowers for some stupid reason. Freshman philosophy class, and somebody would, what superpower would you have? And the point came up that everybody was like, oh, I wish I could read minds, and I was like, no, you don't. No, you don't. If you could read minds, you would be angry at everybody all the time. And then Facebook comes along, goes public, and everybody's just going on Facebook for some reason, telling everybody stuff they shouldn't be talking about in public. And everybody started to hate each other like right away. And I was like, I'm vindicated. You do not want to be able to read minds. And something about that is where a lot of this stuff transformed, I think.
Definitely. One of the weird things is that I think it's still a small percentage of people who are the nuns, as you're calling them. We
call them gender nuns when they're gender studies. I mean, straight up, I refer to people like this woman, Allison Bailey, or even Robin DiAngelo. They're gender nuns.
And yet they punch above their weight. I mean, we are coward, not you and I, but as a society, we are so afraid of pissing them off that we will fire people. We'll do anything. We're very cowardly when it comes to confronting them.
I had a guy. I had a CEO, or one step below CEO, on the C Shield anyway, some company. Tell him, and I'm not going to talk about which company it was actually. To be honest with you, I can't remember, so it doesn't matter. I get a lot of people contacting me. So this guy's telling me, we know who they are. These people that cause these problems in our company. It's like, we know we can't fire them because they'll sue us. They'll make a huge stink. They'll unleash a social media campaign on us or whatever, and it'll be a horrific thing. So they come in and they demand, special treatment or a promotion, and we just give it to them. And then I said something back to him about, it's better if you can identify those people, not to hire them. He's like, oh, a lot of times we know who they are before we hire them. And we know that if we don't hire them, they'll raise a stink. So we hire them anyway. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, just thinking the risk assessment there, that these people can raise such a ruckus.
That's like the behavior of an abused person. I mean, this is some sort of Stockholm syndrome kind of situation when you're caving into people that you're paying money.
Yeah, preemptively caving into them, agreeing to pay them money to come in and abuse you. So I think that there are a couple of features happening if you want to try to understand it. One is, when you're looking at corporate people, it's probably just straight risk assessment and liability, and they've had so much stuff about discrimination lawsuits and so much stuff about sexual harassment and everything, and not for bad reasons. I'm not saying these are bad things, but they've been so repeatedly informed about these things and the possible risks and liabilities that they have, that they can consider it to be less risky to try to just bring the trouble in and manage it from within than to, keep it out or fire it. And I mean, it kind of makes sense.
The thing is, you would think it seems to me like you could discriminate against leftists, because leftists don't have a color. Leftists don't have a gender. I mean, leftists don't have an orientation. You could hire a really diverse group of people that would be that would exclude troublemakers, right? So
Sure.
it shouldn't be that detectable.
I mean, look at the universities. They didn't get to be overwhelmingly left-leaning by accident. There was discrimination in hiring and promotion going on for sure to get to that situation. Um, and that's not, again, racial or sexual. You don't even actually have to discriminate, though, against somebody's political persuasion. My position actually is that I think these people, if you identify who they are at your workplace, they should be fired because they're just going to cause problems. And people say,
Yeah.
oh, you're indulging in cancel culture. And actually, I'm not. I'm actually indulging in a culture of keep your politics out of the workplace.
Yeah. No, I agree. Let me just correct myself or clarify, right? I am not saying keep out people who have a liberal or a progressive political worldview. I wouldn't do that. I don't think that's right. What I am saying is, I mean, there's a whole book, right? Or there's a whole saying about like the don't hire assholes, or we have a
Yeah,
no asshole
exactly.
policy, right? That's what I'm saying.
Exactly.
Like if
No,
someone
that's
is going
right.
to be, if they're going to be intolerant and they're going to cause trouble, and that's what we want to weed out. I mean, any company should want to weed that out.
Yeah, this bring your whole
Any
self to work
culture, right?
thing.
Think of a football team. You want to
Right.
have a good culture, and so you get rid of. There may be players who have good skill, but if they don't fit the culture, you don't want them on the bench or on the team in the locker
No, that's
room.
true. That's true. I actually have a friend of mine is a coach, and he's just having a fit right now. He's talking about how he spent the last 20 years of his career creating a coaching philosophy and building up a team culture that's sustaining from, it's in college, I think. So some of the kids graduate and then new ones come in. And so you've got to have something that sustains the team's culture as there's turnover. And he said he spent 20 years building what he considers to be a positive, nourishing, but also game-winning culture in his players, and it's all just getting just wrecked by these kind of diversity hustlers who demand special treatment and say, oh well, they shouldn't have to. That culture, somehow holds them down or targets them differently or something. So this is touching, not only real
Yeah.
people in real walks of life, but
Yeah.
in places that matter. Because
And in places that used to be considered like immune to this, right? Like, it's like, okay, if you go to college, maybe you have to deal with this, but not on the gridiron, not on the football field, not in Camp Lejeune in basic training.
yeah,
But
wrong.
eventually it makes its way there, right?
It's everywhere. It's everywhere. I hear from people in the military all the time. Yes, I mean I haven't heard specifically from anybody at Lejeune, but yes, it's everywhere. And again, you're now dealing with compromising effectiveness, especially when you're talking about compromise effectiveness of a team unit that has to do something. I mean, playing a sport is important for people who care about the sport. By having your military unit having good teamwork is somewhat more important, because if it fails, you end up with dead people, and that's not good. Hopefully, I mean, it's rare, it does happen, but usually people don't die playing basketball or football or anything else. But people do die in the military, and bad team dynamics is a cause. I mean, I had a police officer reach out to me recently and was talking about how the anti-implicit bias training that they do, or the implicit bias training as they call it, that they do. He says all this is doing, besides wasting our time and costing a lot of money for the city, is training us to add split seconds, milliseconds maybe, but usually more, to decisions that you don't have much more than that, and then you have a dead cop. And he's like, you really, can't be sitting there thinking, when you're dealing with somebody who's charging at you with a weapon or something like that, wait, would this be in violation of a diversity code? Do I think I have an implicit bias against people of this particular demographic? While you're
It's
trying to
amazing
decide if
what
you're
we
going
are
to draw and shoot.
asking. We are asking these police officer. I mean, it would be like the worst job in the world. I mean, it used to be like, glamorous, right? Man, you gotta drive a fast car, carry a badge, carry a gun. Now everyone hates you. Everyone's mad at you. You have to be pretty big. You have to be strong. You have to be like a jujitsu expert. You also have to be like a hostage negotiator. You have to be an HR rep. You have to have a fully you really have to combine a lot of
Apparently,
skills.
a social
And if
worker
you
and de-escalation expert now too.
exactly, and if you had all those skills, why in the hell would you be a police officer? It's
Yeah,
it's
so
a
that you
dangerous
can,
gig.
yeah, so you can deal with people who don't like you. Not typically are you as a police officer, everybody else see the, and it's true, and props to it. We see the police, doing the fun thing with the kids or whatever here and there. Most of your job as a police officer is not dealing with people who are happy to see you, and usually it's not even dealing with people who anybody wants to deal with. The reason the cops get called is because people don't want to deal with that
Yeah.
person anymore, and or they're doing something really bad. And so you have to do this for like no money, and then everybody's calling you horrible names, and at least you have like honor in the whole thing. And now it's like, oh, you're all just the most terrible, racist, awful people.
It's
I
a tough,
can't even
yeah.
fathom it. I can't even
No,
fathom.
tough gig. And like obviously I don't want police officers to I've written a lot about this. I've talked a lot about this. I mean, I don't want them to be targeting people. I don't want them to be mean to people or kill people. And I certainly don't want them to have, to be biased or to have races. I'm just saying it's a tough gig. Um, you know, while I've got you here, one of the things I really want to talk about is to see if we can, or if I can, come to terms with where some of this comes from intellectually, academically. Like this worldview, this woke left wing worldview, and I want to I want to really make it simple so that I can understand and so that everyone can. Uh, we haven't read that much philosophy as you have, but let me just sort of give you my understanding, and then I would invite you to correct me and to help me understand it. But so part of it is the Frankfurt School,
Hmm.
right? And that comes from I don't know, like the 1920s, 1930s,
That's
and
right.
that stressed that we have a false consciousness, which is to say that the masses are kind of manipulated into uh, proper behavior and into being cogs in the machinery by elites, and that's because the masses have a false consciousness. That is, I have three things. I have that critical
That's a key
theory,
idea. So yeah,
that
for
critical
sure.
theory and postmodern. Let me start with the Frankfurt School as an intellectual beginning, roots of where we are today. Did I get that right?
I mean, it had its precursors, but yes, and its precursors can't totally be neglected. And we don't have to get all into like, oh, well, Hegel said, with his process of dialectic. We don't have to get into all of that and his absolute, we don't have to get into Hegel. But Hegel had a student named Marx, Karl Marx, and so the Frankfurt School and Karl Marx is relevant not just because of the communism, the socialism, the whole dialectical process of history, and all of this, but because he had these very specific predictions about how history was going to unfold, and they would lead through these revolutions where the proletariat would rise up, and the working class would rise up, and it would take over the elites, and it would subvert society for kind of this communist utopia. Uh, and that didn't happen. And so that's really important because that's the place. The Frankfurt School didn't come up out of the ground. It wasn't just like these guys thought, oh, let's just destabilize society, with these crazy ideas of critical theory. It's not where the Frankfurt School came from. The Frankfurt School came from trying to figure out why Marx wasn't right, why Marx's ideas of communism should eventually come, but why Western liberal democracies are not accepting of them.
Yeah, and
That
it was
was the
part of it
question at
was
their
like
heart.
bread and circuses, right? I mean, keep them fat and happy, and also and then they will behave in ways that are the masses will do things that actually are not in their own economic self-interest.
That's right. So the general idea was that the elites are setting that these Frankfurt School guys had. It was that the elites are setting up the culture in ways to keep people kind of generally stupid and minimally satisfied and happy with their plebeian existence. Like, oh, well, you don't enjoy the opera, but you have your football game or whatever. And the fact that people are actually happy with this stuff, and with eventually mass-produced things, with at first radio and later television, they're very interested in media and the way that it was used. So the idea was that these elites are setting up this kind of middle culture that keeps people in the middle class just happy enough to refuse to want to overthrow the society for a communist revolution. And that if you can pick those things apart hard enough, then those people will become agitated and will finally realize that they also are oppressed and need liberation from their oppression, and will try to overthrow their elite masters. And then we will then proceed upon Marx's belief about the dialectic of history, from capitalism into late capitalism, evolving into socialism as an intermediate step toward the communist utopia at the end, when the state no longer needs to make sense. And
Right.
so they
So
had
let
an
me
objective.
so let me ask. I mean, okay, so I'm a conservative, I'm a capitalist, I'm a patriotic American, all that stuff.
Uh-huh.
Um,
All
and
right.
I don't think they're just to sort of, lay my cards on the table. And I don't think that there is a conspiracy of elites trying to keep down the middle class or any other group. Having said that, isn't there an element of truth to what they say? Like, isn't there at least some truth to, we don't want people to have a revolution, and there's always going to be income inequality in our system. And if we can keep them happy, as happy as possible, then that will keep us from having, this uprising. Like, isn't there some element of truth to that?
Well, isn't that the magic? The element of truth is how you make the lie work. Um, we all kind of are misled about how propaganda works because we're all very familiar with Hitler's very famous statement about propaganda, or maybe it was Goebbels, I don't know, one or the other, who had said that you tell a lie, and the bigger the lie, the more likely people are to believe it, and then you repeat the lie over and over and over again. But if you actually read about these propaganda ministers and the things that they actually taught, whether it's Mao, whether it's the people under Lenin or Stalin, if you look at Khrushchev later in the Russian context, if you look at Hitler's own propaganda ministers, Goebbels in particular, it was very important that they were accurate. It was very important that they told truth in a selective way that made the big lie. And so there has to be an element of truth to make it believable. If it's just a transparent lie, very few people are likely to believe it.
Mm.
Some will, but most won't. To make an effective propagandizing of people. So if you wanted to have the elites brainwashing people, you would have to have some elements of truth to what they're saying. Simultaneously, it is also true that the elites are generally aware that they don't particularly want a peasant uprising. But I don't know if you've noticed, but the elites tend not to be as effectual at this throughout history as people like to believe that they are. So the master conspiracy of the elites is very unlikely to be true. And that's part of why the Frankfurt School's analysis shifted so dramatically after World War II, because it started in the 20s after World War One, and then World War II happened.
Interrupted by
interrupted
by Hitler.
By Hitler. Yeah, in fact, that's interesting because it moved the Frankfurt School. Frankfurt's in Germany, obviously. The Frankfurt School moved to first Geneva and then to Columbia University in New York City. So it actually became the United States school, but it's still called the Frankfurt School. And so these guys changed character rather tremendously, and it's kind of like where Marx thought it was the economic elites, then it became these kind of cultural bourgeois elites for the early Frankfurt School, and then later it just became after World War II, and you started to have these liberation fronts and liberation movements sparking up all around the world. It just kind of became anybody who they could claim had systemic power, whether that's a class interest, whether that's a race interest, whether that's a political class or whatever. And so there was this evolution in the thought of it. But certainly the idea, there has to be some element of truth that, the Kardashians
And the
are...
systemic thing goes to the policing issue we were just talking about. And once again, I think there is an element of truth to that, right? I mean, there can be, and I'm not saying that America is, fruit of the poisonous tree or something like that, but obviously there can be systemic problems that lead to not an individual being biased or doing something wrong, but sort of that bias institutions. And so, I mean, that's something as a patriotic, conservative American, like, that I can understand and believe that, systemic problems exist.
Sure, and that's a tricky word because systemic problems do refer, like when we think of systemic problems, and like you're speaking about, it's something that's obviously somehow very institutional, and I don't know, the word structural is usually used here, like the networking in between institutions. So you can think that like the police, the criminal justice apparatus, and the prison system. So the police, the courts, and the prisons. That's three separate systems, but they somehow actually work together, and things happen in between them. And so you can think of like the threads between them as like the structure. When you hear words like structural racism, it refers to kind of the things that are happening between institutions. Then you have this institutional thing, like bad laws. And so you could have, for example, you could have a terrible policy. I don't know, perhaps like most of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, that's supposed to help. Nobody's in particular racist or as racist ideas. And yet, when this policy is put into practice, it does create outcomes that have pretty profound negative impacts, and that are biased in certain ways. Where never along the lines was there any intention to create that. And in fact, if we use the Great Society as a good example of what you might call systemic racism at the level of federal policy, then you have the opposite intention. You directly have the opposite intention, kind of going awry. And so certainly these things can exist. But when you talk about systemic in the way that the woke use the word systemic, it's a little bit different, because systemic in that context kind of just means everything we don't know how to explain, plus everything that we do wrapped into the same burrito. So it's kind of like
actually that brings me to what I think is my next theme, which is postmodernism, right? And so as far as I can tell, that is the notion that like you have your truth and I have my truth, and there's it's just subjective. And as far as I can tell, the benefit to embracing postmodernism is that it means no one can ever really prove you're wrong, right? Because if you're not like, if objective reason can't be like marshaled against you, then you have the benefit of like never. It's like a get out of jail free card. Is that related to this?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the tool that's changed everything around in the systemic sense. In fact, postmodernism is, you have correctly identified it, and it has this kind of radical subjectivism at its heart. It's not quite that, you have your truth and I have my truth, and there's no bridge between them. What postmodernism, and this is actually somewhat important, what postmodernism says is that, first of all, the best way to understand what's true and false is through our lived experience, because things like science are unreliable, things like even language is unreliable for communicating it. So the unvarnished lived experience, in this sense, it's kind of, not to get into anything, but it has roots reaching back deeper into French philosophical history to Rousseau, who thought that reason had been tried and failed. So let's go into feelings. And the next thing you know, you have this bloody French Revolution based on his philosophy. But secondly,
that's so funny because, and I want you to pick up. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, please.
But that's so funny because as someone who grew up like in a Christian conservative home, it was liberals always telling me, "Hey, man, that's a superstition, or maybe it's your beliefs, but we have to operate. We have to follow the science. We have to do, we have to follow logic."
Right.
And now you're telling me that we don't follow the logic. We don't follow the science.
So it's kind of funny because if you look at Foucault, who's our Michel Foucault, kind of the postmodern philosopher, there are several, but he's like Mr. Postmodernism, and also the most cited academic in history with something like 1 million citations, which is just an absurd number. Tremendous, believe me. Nobody cited more than Foucault, believe me. Like he's big. And so his whole kind of thing with that was that knowledge and truth are products of the cultures that claim them. And so that was sort of the other big point. So we can kind of seamlessly put these things together. And he was trying to warn people, if you want to be very charitable to his thought, that this is a phenomenon that happens with people over and over and over again. So you have this kind of socially mediated thing called truth. And so the people who you encountered in your home saying, oh, well, we have to follow the science, we have to follow the science, and you just have superstitious beliefs. What Foucault's point would have been is that whoever has the kind of access to systemic power in society gets to be the authenticator of which ways of knowing are true and which ways of knowing are not true, and or valid, I should say. And then those valid ways of knowing create the ability for them to have the power to say, tell you that your way of knowing is not good enough. Yeah. So your Christian beliefs are just superstitions, but we have to follow the science. Now, Foucault kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater with this until later in his life. He kind of circled back a little in the late 70s. It was a little bit more positive about science than he had been earlier on. But the idea that he would say is, oh, well, science is just a product of a culture. And then people since then have looked in and said, well, what culture is it? Well, it's white Western culture. Foucault would have saw it as more of an imperialistic Eurocentric culture. And now
this is full circle now when we're told that math is racist or science is
that's where that comes from. That is correct. Right.
So that's where that comes from. And then the last thing, and maybe I'm missing something, the last thing I have, the last thread is critical theory.
Mm-hmm. So critical theory is the project of the Frankfurt School, or one of the main projects. It's kind of their engine. So critical theory was actually outlined for the first time formally in the late 1930s, just before World War II broke out. As a matter of fact, the book was in 1937. And it outlines this idea, which again, if you talk about intellectual precursors, it's diving off of Marx and off of Hegel, but it takes this idea that it's not going to be enough to understand the world. You have to understand the world for a purpose, and that purpose is to change it. And then if you're going to change it, then there's a right way to change it. There's a right outcome of history that you have to work toward. And so critical theory was devised as a means to take that vision of history and come up with critique for how the systems that are in play are failing to achieve the supposedly inevitable dialectic of history. I know that was some heavy lifting, but basically the idea was that they separated understanding a thing in its most basic sense to know how it works and called that traditional theory. So what we would call science and what we would call philosophy, they categorized as traditional theory that tries to understand how things work. And again, if we want to talk about the roots, Hegel saw this as, he called this understanding. And then there's a second level that Hegel talked about that was reason, which was basically his ideas being right above on a higher level. But the critical theorist said, now we have this separate thing from understanding the thing is understanding how it doesn't produce the outcomes in society that we say are virtuous.
So like, let's say we're watching Rocky IV. The traditional critique might be, well, look at the lighting. The lighting's not great here. The camera angle's not great. But then the critical theory might be, I don't think this movie is really achieving the message. Is the message really the right message? That American imperialism is going to conquer the Soviet Union, or am I on? Is that sort of a microcosm that a simple person such as
yes,
such as the person you're talking to might get?
Yes, so that's kind of actually an excellent way to look at it. But I want to make it really clear that with critical theory, it is not sufficient to say it's not achieving the message that it intends. It has to be that it's not achieving a message that aligns with the proper values that will lead us to the place in history where we think we should go. That's not a message that will get us to the right side of history. So they would say that Rocky IV reinscribes or reinforces or legitimizes imperialist tropes and about American superiority and exceptionalism and the inferiority of other cultures outside of American, the American empire. And so they would see it wholly, they would recast the entire thing wholly as a piece of propaganda
Yeah.
that's trying to create a certain culture that will, you know, provide American backbone that isn't going to follow the, you know, maybe Soviet example or something like that.
Right. Okay, so I'm down with criticizing things. I think nobody's perfect, no system's perfect. I don't think we should just be beating ourselves up constantly. That's not healthy. But if we want to poke around a little bit, make ourselves better, we're not good at this, we're not good at that. That could be healthy. We do have some systemic problems we need to fix. Let's prod around there. But it
So I'll give
sounds
you an
like part of
example, actually, if you let me
well,
cut
it
in.
sounds like part of the problem is the agenda behind it, right? It's
Yes,
not
yes.
it's not for the purpose of making the system stronger. It's for the purpose of transforming the system into something that you and I would probably see as well. I'll use the word evil as bad, as bad.
No, I'll go ahead with the word evil. I have done so, and I use that word with some caution. And so I agree with that. That is correct. It is that there is an agenda behind it, and I will also add that there's a method. So critical theory, kind of put in its nicest form, is supposed to help you see assumptions in blind spots that you're not aware of, right? So you have
Yeah,
this
and I
idea
think
of,
those exist
well,
totally.
they
I'm
sure do.
I
And
believe,
so I'll
yeah.
give you an example of kind of the, you want to think of it like the like Star Wars, like the Jedi and the Sith, right? So you've got the light side of the Force and the dark side of the Force. If you think of critical theory sort of as the Force, the light side is often, and not always, but is often done through humor, especially gentle humor. You can think about, you know, these comedians to the 80s and 90s. I think this is just such a huge deal. Even in the 70s, these kind of, you know, Richard Pryor, and then later you have like Eddie Murphy, not Kid Rock, Chris Rock. You have you know, all of these different black comedians in particular. We could name lots of them: Bernie Mac, uh, D.L. Hewley. We could name lots and lots of these people. Steve Harvey, I guess, that did this kind of race-based humor that allowed white people to laugh at themselves. And I see that as the light side of critical theory.
Yeah.
Whereas the dark side of the
But
force,
you're also maybe learning too, right?
yeah, sure.
You're laughing at yourself, but it's not overtly hostile, but you're also like learning your own foibles a little bit.
Exactly. You're seeing these blind spots, these things you hadn't necessarily considered before. And I mean, we don't have to talk just about race-based humor. You know, my wife just loves this one comedian. He's British, and I can't think of his name, but he's always just joking about things about, you know, how hotels are organized. You know, just the silly absurdities with how corporate organization makes this thing not quite work or whatever. You know, so these kinds of, this is again, comedy, especially when it's well done, can be a form of the light side of critical theory, whereas the dark side utilizes primarily shame. So you're not making people laugh, you're making people hate themselves. It's a very different dynamic. And there's also the difference between the agenda. Is there opening one's mind, or is there shepherding somebody along a particular agenda and path that you think is the one virtuous one that everybody should follow? These are different things, right? So, you know, only a Sith only deals in absolutes or something like that. So, you know, you can see the difference between the light side and the dark side of critical theory in this regard. And I don't think that the thing that's formally called critical theory with a capital C and capital T, I'm not the one that added those capital letters, that came out of the Frankfurt School. I don't think that that is a healthy version of something that is a form of criticism that can actually be quite useful and is in fact critical to the liberal process, the enlightenment process of questioning our assumptions and questioning our biases, questioning authority, because illegitimate authority exists everywhere, and it does need to be questioned and challenged if we're going to actually have real progress that helps people.
It seems like they use this might just be a very obvious statement, but it seems like they use the liberal values of like tolerance um, and open mindedness when they want to, but then they also are intolerant themselves, and they really are about coercion, right? At some
Yes.
point, and that's where this becomes very, very dangerous, is they want to force you And it could be as simple as force you to use this pronoun.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, you will be punished in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the opposite of like the liberal values that we used to have.
That's right. And this is actually an interesting point where you talk about tolerance, because this is one example where it's very explicit in their literature that there was a shift from the liberal value of tolerance to the critical, I should say anti-value, but we'll say the critical value of tolerance. They see these things differently. The essay was by one of the members of the Frankfurt School. His name is Herbert Marcuse. He's one of the more famous members of 20th century philosophy. He was at Columbia University in particular. He has some other relevance. He was a doctoral advisor to Angela Davis, who's one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter and prison abolition movement even today. So he's got connect. I mean, he's reverberating very directly still through history. But in 1965, he wrote an essay called Repressive Tolerance. And that essay goes on to discuss what he doesn't call it repressive tolerance in the essay, which is, I think, a bit strange because it is the title of the essay. He refers to it as a discriminating tolerance. So he goes through and tells you what you can be tolerant of and what you shouldn't be tolerant of. And he's quite explicit about it, is that you should be tolerant of left-wing things and you should be intolerant of right-wing things. And it's up to people who understand the difference between the reactionary and the revolutionary to define which is which. He even says, in fact, that you should be accepting of left-wing violence, but not right-wing violence. And again, those are defined kind of in a very purposed way. So this is a short read. I do encourage people. It takes half an hour at the most to read this thing in detail. It's free online. Just Google it. themarxist.org. People put everything in the universe out there for free, at least they're consistent.
What's it called again? How can they Google it?
Repressive Tolerance.
Okay.
And Marcuse, if you add his name, it'll pop right up near the top. It's spelled Marcuse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask this question. Obviously, there's not a straight line from the Frankfurt School or from postmodernism to the radical left, the intolerant left.
No,
I shouldn't just call them the left.
There is a straight line from the Frankfurt School to both Black Lives Matter and Antifa. There is
all right. That's my question. Help us connect the dots. Why is it important? Why is it important we know about this history?
Well, I mean, we haven't talked about some of these other theorists that are relevant, in particular, a French psychoanalyst named Frantz Fanon. But Herbert Marcuse's plus this guy, Frantz Fanon, his philosophy is basically a great deal of the engine underlying both Black Lives Matter and Antifa, which are very different things in some regards. The Black Lives Matter has grown out of what was known as the Black Liberation Movement. Black Liberation Movement was partially inspired by Herbert Marcuse, although it also picked up off of, like I said, Fanon and these liberation movements that arose out of Fanon's work around the world. South America and Central America are very famous, but the most well-known liberation movement was in North Vietnam. It was called the Viet Cong. So these liberation movements, these actually all had this kind of big conference thing in 1968. Very famously, and it's a year of great unrest. And Marcuse and such were involved in all of this. And so there's a very straight line between the liberation movements to the Black Liberation Project. And part of the Black Liberation Project is Angela Davis, who was the student of, not just like an incidental student of Herbert Marcuse. She reflects that Herbert Marcuse is the one who radicalized her. And then she went to Palestine and got even more radicalized. Okay, so Angela Davis I saw Angela Davis on television several times right before the election and since the election, talking about how it's very important that we pressure Joe Biden in this particular way. It's very important that Joe Biden wins. We don't really want Joe Biden. He's not radical enough, but we can pressure him. We can mold him. We can bend him to our will. And that's why he needs to win. I think she said that on Russia Today. So Angela Davis is very much still active. She was very much instrumental in the creation of what has become Black Lives Matter and the movements that inspired it. So there's a straight line there. And Antifa is basically, like I said, this guy, Frantz Fanon, which we haven't talked about, so we don't have to get into it. But take his philosophy about colonized regions and how people who have been colonized should react, and mix it with Marcuse's ideas of repressive tolerance as Marcuse put it in Repressive Tolerance, he says we live in a permanently imminent state where fascism could break out at any point once you have a liberal order. And so they see liberalism as a precursor to fascism, which is why you see them marching through the streets of Denver now holding signs that say things like, F fascism and the liberalism that enables it.
Let me ask you, what percentage, and I know, look, I realize after, George Floyd and all the stuff that's happened, we've had a lot of just, normal Americans who really just care about this country, who were protesting and all that. I'm not talking about them, but even among the people that you would consider like activists, like on college campuses, what percentage of them do you think are just sort of well-meaning, if misguided, versus the people who really understand what they're doing, what percentage really are the agitators who get the agenda, who are down with this cause all the way, hardcore?
So, I mean, I'll break it down to percentages, but I want to give you a metaphor in a second. So I don't know the real percentages, so these are all just kind of guesses, but I would figure that the proportion of people who actually know the agenda is not more than 5%. And then you have to mix in people who understand it but don't believe it and know how to game it, because this is one of the most griftable things in the universe. All you have to do is, say the right things and you get the keys to the castle, as long as you say them in the right ways and attack the right people at the right times. It's the most griftable thing in the entire universe. So there are going to be some percentage of grifters. If we look at the baseline sociopath percentage of the population as a guess, to approximate how many are just dishonest grifters, we can guess that's probably about 3%. I would guess somewhere between 4 and 6% actually are fully understanding what's going on. We guess that by looking at the percentage that are graduating and colleges out of these departments, and then everybody else is kind of coming along for the ride. So the metaphor I use for this is like a church, actually. So you have your theologians right at the top in some sense of theological knowledge, and they know their stuff. These are the people who have lifetime appointments at seminaries to be professors of theology and so on. And then you come down a notch from them. Who do they teach and train? They teach pastors or priests. And these people, I'll kind of stick with pastors, sort of the Protestant model. These people are quite theologically sophisticated in many cases, but they're not theologians in most cases either. There's a gap in their depth of theological understanding. And so now we've gone from like the pure theorists down to people who are all in. And that's going to be your those two groups together are going to compose your 4 to 6% of people who are all in. We also have your people, and I won't name any particular people, but we all know who we're talking about because they're on TV a lot, the fake pastors with their expensive shoes needing a new jet, that are your grifters, that's going to be, I think they're about 3% of those people. Then below that, within the laity, you don't just have like a laity, you have deacons, and they're probably a little more into it than other people. And then I had a friend in high school who took notes at church, right? Like, who does that? I only knew one guy in my entire life who took notes at church. So you have that guy, that level, that's your people who are kind of into the major, or maybe they minored in it and they're really serious about it. And then below that, you have people who go to church and they sing the songs and they think about it, and they're definitely a Christian, but if you ask them what the ransom theory of atonement is and whether or not they accept it, they don't know. They've never heard of it. They don't know. They have no idea. And then you get a little further down till you finally get to the people who, yeah, I'm a Christian, of course, I love Jesus, but they haven't been to church this year. Right. So you have these different levels of people who are different levels of serious, who have taken on different levels of stuff. Maybe they have like their WWJD bracelet, but they don't go to church, or they don't really know, their favorite Bible verse is God helps those who help themselves.
Right.
If you follow me,
cleanliness is next to godliness.
Yeah. I mean, so you have this kind of you have to think of it in a very similar structure to the social structure around a religion, where you've got your theologians, your religious leaders, your deacons, your very serious parishioners. Then you kind of get into the laity, and the laity has people who are more or less sophisticated, pay attention a little more or less, go to church more or less often, all the way down to the people who are like, yeah, I'm Christian, but you couldn't identify a single clear Christian thing. They just do it because it makes them a good person.
Right.
And that's like the
Let- let-
person who's putting the black square on their Instagram and they're like, okay, I've done my Black Lives Matter for the year.
Right. Slacktivism. Let me ask you this. I mean, you obviously know a lot about this. We've only scratched the surface. This has to be super depressing to know this much. Like, isn't it, did it bum you out?
For a long
does
time.
it bum you out to dwell on this negativity?
No, because I know I'm doing something productive with it, but learning it the first time for a lot of it was it was a very painful process. There were a few different phenomena that are worth mentioning. One was when I started to see its attacks on science, in that I have a background, my PhD is in math, but my bachelor's degree was in physics. So I've always had kind of a lifelong love of science, even if I'm not a scientist myself. And to see their attacks on science, and to see those things, because I also have this high esteem for the university when I was reading this, and the academy and scholarship and everything, those scholars, it's a big deal. And I'm reading these things in academic journals that are just baseless attacks on science. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I actually went into some minor depressions. Like at one point, I read one paper and I just kind of shut the door and refused to interact with anybody for like 3 days. It was like my dog died almost. It was like just catastrophic upset. And then another phenomenon is that as you read, you go through these stages when you read it. I actually think about, the old Taoist saying is that when you encounter anything, there's 3 stages. There's a stage where you don't know anything about it, so you can't do it. Then there's a stage where you have to try really hard to do it. And then there's the stage after that where you're a master, so you just do it without thinking. So there's the stage in the middle where you think about it a lot. And then there's the stages on either side where you don't think about it very much. And so I was thinking about that in terms of watching. I don't know how to say this in any nice way, but you read, say, for example, critical race theory specifically, and you become racist. It makes you racist. You see race everywhere. You take this stuff in. You can't not see race. I hear this from people all the time. And you start to realize how racist you are as a result of it. And not in the normal, old-fashioned way that you might associate with something like the Klan, but in this very weird way, where you're very aware of race and you make race very relevant to everything, but there's this kind of dark cloud over it. And then my experience and my colleagues' experience who have endured long enough with it, you break through the other side. And I even wrote about this fairly recently. And I said, if you push through to the other side, you get to this place where you can, like, I can see social phenomena and interactions in real time now and do the critical race theory analysis like it's breathing. Like I'm completely fluent. And so then I can also immediately think, this is what critical race theory would think about that, and that's terrible. And so since I can understand it and reject it immediately, I actually end up having a more positive experience and can see kind of the light side of the thing that I wouldn't have been able to see as clearly had I not gone through this. But if I weren't as fluent in it now as I was, if we were having this conversation 2 years ago, I would tell you it's depressing every day because that's where I was at the time.
How can let's try to maybe get something positive out of this? I mean, is the message just that this has always been around? It rears its ugly head once in a while, and then it'll recede, and we just have to be vigilant and fight it? Or is there a way that we can take the good from this and have a more perfect union? Like, is there a positive outcome to this?
Well, you got kind of a couple different questions there. One of the things that what I just said is for those who do have the fortitude to push through it, there is a more perfect union kind of thing that comes out the other side where you can compare it against proper values like merit and individualism and universal humanity and goodwill and charity and all of these things that they don't seem to like. So you can push through and get to that kind of positive place. There are also
even just having those words in our toolbox would help us push back when they attack us, right? I mean,
right.
I don't think a lot of us traditional Americans, whatever, I don't know what, we'll call us liberals, are equipped.
No, that's right.
To fight rhetorically.
We've completely, well, first of all, yeah, we've ceded the rhetorical ground completely and have to get it back. We've also forgotten what liberal values look like. So if you don't want to push through it, there is still okay, you don't want to read Herbert Marcuse or any of these, Robin DiAngelo or these race people. I don't blame you. Don't do it. Go read Locke. Go read Paine, go read Jefferson, read the Federalist Papers, read the Anti-Federalist Papers, read the Declaration of Independence, go read the foundations of liberalism and remember what we're standing up for and be able to articulate that, because we've been able to be lazy since the fall of the Soviet Union, at least. So it's, over 30 years ago. We've been able to be lazy and not have to really understand liberalism and what makes America great in some sense against the backdrop of something else. If you want to talk about the more perfect union aspect, though, I started to say you can actually take from this. There are, we talked about earlier, that there's kernels of truth tucked here and there. I think, for example, if you kind of like throw away all of the part where they're throwing a fit and calling everybody racist and blaming everybody for everything, but pay attention that they're asking people to listen more. I think that we can all learn to listen more. I think that we will have a more perfect union if we start listening more. But we do have to understand that listening doesn't mean believe. Listen and consider is great. We should be listening more. We should take more things seriously. You can think about, situations where in the past, for example, Black people would tell a story and people would basically just say, yeah, they're Black, they don't understand it, and they weren't listening. Well, we can definitely listen more, but we don't have to believe. So a good example, they talk about the lived experience. You have to believe my lived experience. No, you don't. Because if I go to the hospital, and this gives a great example of breaking it down to both sides of it. If I go to the hospital, I'm having, let's say in reality, we all, the omniscient eye of the story outside of everything knows I'm having a panic attack. From my lived experience, I'm having a heart attack and dying. I can't breathe. My chest hurts. I'm clamping up. I'm freaking out. I'm going to die. I'm going to pass out. I'm going to die. And I go to the hospital with these, emergency room or whatever, with these symptoms. And I tell them I'm dying. I'm having a heart attack. It is not their job. And in fact, they will kill me if they listen to my lived experience and believe me. It is their job to take very seriously that I'm having some kind of a medical event that's causing me a great deal of distress, and then to hook me up to an EKG and find out if it really is my heart, and to get the real evidence out of the story that I believe is true. My lived experience is dramatically misleading me. But it doesn't mean that we can't listen to it and use that as the basis for a serious consideration. Because if it is my heart, they have to act. But if it's not my heart, they have to act differently. And that's a very important distinction. So we should be listening more, but we don't have to take people's claims about their experience at face value. So if somebody says, I experienced racism on my college campus, it's perfectly appropriate to say, okay, that sucks. I don't want to, I hope that's not happening. Tell me what's going on. Let's hear some more about it. And then if it merits a certain level, let's have a formal inquiry, show us the evidence, let's find the evidence. But when you see, for example, like what happened at Evergreen State College, when they asked for evidence, they were shouted back at and said, asking for, if you lived it, you would know the evidence. And so you wouldn't ask for evidence. So asking for evidence is proof of racism. Imagine if I went to the hospital with my panic attack and I said, I'm having a heart attack. And they said, no, you're having a panic attack and you need to do, lay here and breathe and this and that. And we're going to keep an eye on you, or whatever they do for a panic attack. I don't actually know. And I said, no, you have to, if you were living this, you would know it's a heart attack. You have to hit me with the paddles right now. And if I were to get my way, what would happen?
Yeah. You're going to give me a panic attack with these. It's so frustrating. Asking for evidence is proof that you don't get it, man. Let me ask you this. I have a sense, and we haven't really talked overtly about like electoral or campaign politics, but I'd love to end on this.
Sure.
My sense is that Donald Trump has exacerbated the problem and made things worse. Although I do agree with him, some of this diversity training was probably, I'm guessing, radical indoctrination. So he's done some good things. I think overall, though, Trump has probably been a net negative. Joe Biden, he's a guy who seems to be a centrist. He did not cave in. They tried to take him down. They tried to Me Too him. He did not do what the woke Twitter told him to do. On the other hand, I am a little concerned that, eventually he will succumb. I'd love to get your take on Trump and Biden.
Well, I can tell you at the very least, this is actually somewhat complicated to talk about both of them. So we can focus on Biden for the moment. I can tell you at the very least that the activists the woke activists and the radical activists, and I want to kind of separate them just a little bit, like we talked about a bit before, definitely are going to pressure him, and they're going to pressure him extremely hard, and they will pull out many of the tactics that they used, that they practiced and used on the population in particular during Trump's tenure, in order to put pressure on Biden to see if they can get Biden to fold. And I know that. I don't claim that that's the case. I'm not guessing. I'm not prognosticating. I know that because they've said it repeatedly. That Angela Davis, in the interview that I actually mentioned earlier, explicitly said that she wanted Biden not because he is the right guy for what they want, but because he's the one that's more likely to cave into their pressure. That means that they're intending to put lots of pressure on him. And so certainly we're going to see Biden get tested in that way. I don't think that anything, literally anything on the Democratic side of the aisle right now, and I don't think most of the things on the Republican side of the aisle right now have anything like the tools necessary to resist that pressure. And so what they will end up doing is taking in at least some part of that in greater or lesser degree, depending on the circumstance and who's involved, and some different factors and what's happening in the broader picture. But I think that we'll end up seeing a lot of this stuff getting onboarded by Biden, because I don't think he or anybody around him has any of the necessary tools to withstand it, at least not withstand it vigorously. Trump doesn't even have those tools, but Trump at least did put forth that statement, the executive order, I should say, about race and sex stereotyping, which is his infamous critical race theory training. It's not accurate to call it a executive order on diversity training, because Section 10 explicitly says you can do diversity training as long as you don't do these things. And the things that are listed actually would also take white supremacy off the table. They would also take patriarchy off the table. You can't scapegoat on race or sex. You can't stereotype on race or sex. You can't discriminate on race or sex. Why people want to put that back in, I have no idea. It's actually a really wonderful executive order.
Well, they're all things. It goes back to like the obvious point that like what things that Martin Luther King Jr. advocated, such as, I don't know if he used the term colorblind society. I think he did, but that whole concept is seen now as racist, right?
Right. So I don't know for sure whether Martin Luther King used that statement or that phrase or not, but I do know that the slogan that was, his movement that was happening around him, the actual civil rights movement, was, and you can look this up all over. It's all, Google it. It's just amazing to see the signs of all these well-dressed black men, and obviously black and white photos from the 60s, holding up these signs that say, "I am a man." They don't say "I'm a black man." They say "I am a man." And so the idea is that that color blindness is what's being promoted. So that was certainly part of the ethos that was happening around that. So I think that I actually suspect we're going to see a lot of wokeness brought in under Biden's nose, and I think he's actually going to push a lot in. I think he's very likely to repeal or overturn, I should say, that executive order pretty much right away. I would guess, and no, it's not a guess, he's actually said he intends to do it, is to reinvigorate the Title IX, which was very feminism-based conditions that he helped install in 2011 that created the kind of campus kangaroo courts. So that's very, third wave feminism.
I wrote a piece at the Daily Beast urging Biden to think twice before trying to roll back the Title IX, Betsy DeVos reform, and Trump's executive order on what I call diversity training.
I think I saw that. Yeah. I don't think
I don't like to call myself a hero, but
I'll call you one. But unfortunately, I don't think that we have a lot of sway over that as commentators. Now, the question of whether Trump made all of this worse is a very interesting question that I've been giving a lot of reflection to. I mean, the superficial answer is an obvious yes, but I don't think it's as simple as that. And I'm not just trying to be, contrarian here. I think this is actually a deep and hard question. Trump was certainly very useful, and some of the things he did, especially early on, really were able to be interpreted in terms of this critical race theory in particular analysis, but also I guess also the feminist analysis with the Me Too and the whole, his grab them by the crotch. We'll censor that for your listeners' tender ears kind of statements and his kind of boorish behaviors. So he definitely provided the fodder. But what I think happened is that the narrative that built up around that and some of his other behaviors and antics and utterances, which were in some cases quite troubling anyway, they were a very good confirmation of a theory that was already starting to mainstream. And so he became a very useful foil, which isn't quite this to convince people that, oh, this theory is true, which isn't quite the same thing as him making it worse. And it's also, I think, quite apparent that there has been a highly distorted reaction to Trump and his tenure in office. In fact, I think this is a very important point. I've been very frustrated. I've been saying it for several days to my poor wife, who has to listen to me rant about this. The media, for example, I don't want to be one of these, the media, but the media has had the opportunity for the past 4 years and change, if you count his ever since he won the primary in 2016, in the summer of 2016, they've had 4 years and change to try to tamp down how alarming his presidency is being interpreted. And they did not do that. In fact, they did the exact opposite at every turn. They at no point did they say, okay, this is concerning, but let's see what happens. It was always, he's a Nazi. He's an all-out Nazi. And just look at the stuff that got put out in the months preceding the election about him going to steal the election. He's going to do this. It's going to be a coup. It's going to, all of this crazy stuff. It's been constantly full tilt. He's a racist. I even wrote in July of 2016, I wrote an essay saying, I didn't want Trump to win. I said, if you don't want Trump to win, keep calling him racist.
Yeah.
Or maybe I got that backwards.
Oh yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Yeah, no, I get what you're saying.
If you keep calling him racist, he's going to win. He's going to win on this. You're giving him fuel. Stop doing it, is what I was trying to urge people to do. It's very important that people realize that this is a symbiotic relationship that Trump was playing off of very successfully. Yeah. And so my actual analysis would be more that we had in Trump, and I will not try to defend various aspects of his character, and I will not try to defend various aspects of his speech or manner, but in him, we definitely had an anti-establishment candidate who became an anti-establishment president, who the establishment was very, very, very mad about having. And then Trump is not the kind of guy who stands for it. And so they punched him and he punched back. And this created a dynamic in game theory. It's like playing iterated prisoner's dilemma and doing tit for tat, and you just keep whacking the other guy back and forth over and over and over again, and it accelerates and gets worse. So I don't know that I don't know if you consider him to be at fault for hitting back when he got hit, then on the one hand, you have a point, he accelerated it, but on the other hand, you're also kind of, and I hate to say it for Trump, but you're kind of victim blaming because the reason that I think that Biden and most of all of the Democrats and most of the Republicans would fold to this radical ideology is because they know if they hit in a certain way, if people hit back, then they look bad. It's actually a known strategy written throughout their literature called creating a decision dilemma, where you either force a person to fold and look weak, or you get them to hit you back and then you make them out to be a bully and a bad guy. And I think that Trump refused to fold in most cases, and they played up his refusal to fold and then claimed he was the one accelerating the thing. And I don't know.
I think Trump creates a decision dilemma all the time.
Oh, yeah,
a lot of times for Republicans.
Oh,
it's an interesting tactic.
He absolutely does. Because it's necessary. Again, the majority of people who are, I don't want to be like this, populist weirdo, because I'm not a populist, but the majority of people who are outside of the establishment look at this kind of thing and they say, oh, well, the establishment is already pushing in a particular way. And Trump understands the game that they're playing, so he's playing it back on them. And there's some truth to this, at least with the media. The man knows how to manipulate the media, and the media reacts like, like a clapping seal almost every time. So I guess there's some degree of matter of interpretation here. But my opinion for 3 of the past 4 years, or 3.5 of the past 4 years, would have been, yeah, Trump's definitely accelerating it, and maybe it needs to be accelerated. So kind of an accelerationist argument, or maybe it's a bad thing that's being accelerated. But then my argument for the last few months would have shifted to, no, I think that they were flipping out at the presence of somebody they can't control more than anything else. And he can't be blamed for not being pushed around by somebody who's trying to push him around. So there's elements of both of those things, I think, present. I don't want to say, oh, Trump's great, because that's not me. But I think that this is like I said, when I started talking about Trump just a moment ago, this is a more complicated dynamic than people are giving it credit for. They're seeing it very simplistically and not understanding that it's actually a much more complex phenomenon that's much richer in terms of what it's telling us about the world than a lot of people are taking for granted.
Indeed. All right. Well, I tell you what, this has been a really thought-provoking conversation, and I've learned a lot. And it's been an easy. We could just keep going, but
I love it. Yeah, we go full.
Let me ask you.
Let's do it.
Let's plug some stuff. How can people? Obviously, they should get the book. They should follow you on Twitter. What should they do?
I mean, if you want the most unmitigated access to me possible, Twitter is the place to get it. I am a bit of a character on Twitter. I'm not an easy follow. I don't claim to be, so it may not be to your taste. But I'm at Conceptual James.
At Conceptual James, right?
Yep. And I'm essentially using that same handle everywhere that there is social media to be had. So I think it's the same thing on Facebook. It's the same thing on Instagram. It's the same thing on Parler. I finally made a Parler. I don't really use it yet, but it's there. I've tried to be pretty consistent. I have my website, newdiscourses.com, that you can go to. You can get the book Cynical Theories. You can get the previous book. If you want something that's less about this and something about what can you do as an average person, I actually wrote a book that doesn't look like my Twitter feed whatsoever a little over a year ago with my other colleague, Peter Boghossian, that's titled How to Have Impossible Conversations. So you can talk to people who you disagree with, so you can start to communicate with these people that you've written out of your life for the last 4 years finally, and start building bridges back. It's part of the way forward, I think. So, you can do that. But social media, whether you're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or Parler, it's at Conceptual James. The people at OnlyFans are trying to recruit me as an influencer, but I haven't given in, so I don't have an OnlyFans yet.
Well, this is for porn stars, right?
Yeah, it's so absurd. It's hilarious. They asked me if I wanted to be an influencer on OnlyFans, and I said, I don't know about this.
Hilarious. Awesome. Okay, get the book, Cynical Theories. Follow him on Twitter at Conceptual James. James Lindsay, thank you for coming on the news.
Thanks, Matt.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.